For 10 years, she called me worthless. At her own son's funeral, she said it to my face one final time, and I still didn't know it would be the last time she ever got to. I didn't know it that morning, sitting in a lawyer's office I never expected to be summoned to, that everything she'd spent a decade convincing our family to believe about me was about to unravel in front of everyone who had ever doubted me. My name is Emily. I married my husband Thomas 11 years ago, and from the very first family dinner, his mother Patricia made her opinion of me clear. "She's not one of us," she told Thomas within earshot, loudly enough to make sure I heard every word. "She'll never understand what this family has built." Patricia came from old money, a family business, generations of careful wealth, a certain expectation of who belonged at her table. I came from a small town, a modest upbringing, and a work ethic she never once acknowledged, let alone respected. For 10 years, I endured it quietly for Thomas's sake. Patricia criticized my clothes, my career, my cooking, my very presence at family gatherings. Worthless became her favorite word for me, whispered just loud enough for me to hear, never quite loud enough for Thomas to confront directly. "I don't know what my son sees in someone so ordinary," she said once, at my own birthday dinner. Smiling as though she'd offered a compliment, I stayed for Thomas. I stayed because I loved him, because our marriage was strong even when his mother worked tirelessly to convince him otherwise, because I believed, foolishly perhaps, that 10 years of quiet dignity would eventually earn some measure of respect. It never did. When Thomas passed away suddenly 2 years ago, a heart condition none of us saw coming, Patricia's cruelty didn't soften with grief. It sharpened. At his funeral, standing over his casket, she leaned toward me and said the words that would echo in my mind for months afterward, "At least now the family fortune won't be wasted on someone worthless." I said nothing. I simply held my composure, buried my husband, and told myself I would survive whatever she had planned next. What I didn't know that day was that Thomas had made a decision of his own, one his mother knew absolutely nothing about, one that would change everything the moment his final will was finally read. The 2 years following Thomas's death were among the loneliest of my life. Patricia made it clear, almost immediately, that she considered my place in the family finished along with my marriage. She stopped inviting me to family gatherings. She spoke to mutual friends, subtly suggesting I had married for money and never truly loved her son. Lies so absurd, I almost couldn't believe she said them aloud, yet devastating in how easily people seemed to believe her. I grieved Thomas privately, without the support of the family I had spent a decade trying to belong to. Some nights I sat alone in the home we'd built together, wondering if Patricia's cruel words carried some hidden truth, if perhaps I really had never belonged, if perhaps 10 years of quiet endurance had all been for nothing. But Thomas, in the final years of his life, had seen something Patricia refused to see. He'd watched me care for his ailing father before he passed, sitting beside his hospital bed long after Patricia herself had left for the evening, exhausted by a devotion she called obligation, and I simply called love. He'd watched me build a modest but meaningful career of my own, refusing every offer of financial help from his family, determined to prove, if only to myself, that my worth had never depended on their approval. Thomas never told me directly what he'd decided regarding his estate. He'd always been a quiet, deliberate man, someone who preferred actions to conversations, decisions to declarations. I assumed, the way most people do in grief, that whatever inheritance existed would follow the traditional path, split evenly, or perhaps weighted toward the family business Patricia had spent her life protecting. I received the call about the will reading 18 months after the funeral. Patricia had delayed it, tangled in legal complexities regarding the family trust, determined, I suspect, to control the outcome as thoroughly as she'd controlled every other aspect of our family's life. Sitting in that lawyer's office, Patricia beside me for the first time in over a year. I braced myself for whatever final indignity she had planned. But what I didn't know that morning was that Thomas had left behind something Patricia never saw, coming: a decision made quietly, deliberately, months before his death, one that would finally speak the truth she had spent a decade trying to silence. The lawyer read Thomas's will slowly, carefully, in a voice that grew heavier with every line. Thomas had left the majority of his personal estate, not the family business, which remained legally protected under Patricia's trust, but everything he had built independently, every investment, every property he'd purchased without his mother's help, entirely to me. Attached to the will was a letter, written in Thomas's familiar handwriting, addressed not to me but to his mother. "Mom, I know you've never understood why I chose Emily. But she stayed. She stayed when it was hard, when you made it harder, when there was nothing in it for her except loving me. That's worth more than anything this family has ever built. I hope, someday, you see what I always saw." Patricia's face went pale as the lawyer finished reading. For the first time in 11 years, I watched the woman who had called me worthless at every possible opportunity sit in complete, humbled silence. She didn't apologize that day. Some people, I've learned, never truly do. But something shifted in the months that followed. Patricia reached out, hesitantly at first, attempting a fragile reconciliation neither of us fully trusted yet. I didn't owe her forgiveness, and I made no promises I couldn't keep. But I also didn't close the door entirely, choosing grace over the bitterness she had spent a decade offering me. I used part of my inheritance to open a small business of my own, something modest, something entirely mine, built without a single dollar of family money attached to it. Patricia attended the opening, quietly, standing near the back of the room, watching without a word. People sometimes ask if I regret staying in that family for 11 difficult years, enduring a decade of quiet cruelty for a love that occasionally felt one-sided. I tell them no, because Thomas saw me clearly, even when his own mother refused to. And in the end, the truth he left behind mattered more than any inheritance ever could. I didn't destroy Patricia that day in the lawyer's office. I simply stopped needing her approval to know my own worth. And that, I've come to understand, was the only justice that ever truly mattered.